Senator Alex Antic, Senator for South Australia and representing the Liberal Party. Great to talk with you again on Flow.
Good morning, Ricky.
Now, I wanted to come back to something I picked up on last week before we had a chance to chat about this on air, but Chinese President Xi Jinping, they've staged this great event marking the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's rule in China. He said something that really should have stirred people up, I would have thought, saying that China's enemies will have their heads bashed bloody on the Great Wall of Steel and the Chinese 1.4 billion population. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I thought the rhetoric in that speech generally was quite extraordinary, and I think that was one of a number of comments that really should be alarming. That one probably sticks out more than any because it's sort of an overt, poke in the eye to countries like Australia, I think, and it was filled with this sort of nationalism, patriotism, which is all fine, but blended in there was this sense of them against us, and it was quite extraordinary. In fact, there was a columnist, I think it was Andrew Bolt, who wrote an article earlier in the week about the comparisons between a similar speech that Hitler made at a similar time before World War II and compared it to the one that Xi made. And there was some interesting analysis in there that about the trajectory of that rhetoric, which was that I think the word rejuvenation was used 26 times, and the phrase the Chinese nation was used 44 times, which was exactly double the number of times it was used by Hu in a previous speech. So, look, I think there's only one way to read that, and that is that the voice is growing louder, and this is the way of this regime. They run a style of government called wolf warrior diplomacy, which is all about loud noises, bellicose rhetoric, and getting the message out there that we're here to play.
And they are a nation with a very, very long memory. I know they had some elephants running amok in China recently on all through these villages and had to move thousands of people because they came up from the south. But they have elephantine memories, the Chinese. They're still seeking reparation against the West, I think, for the way they were crushed during the Opium Wars. It seems all of that rhetoric, they treat that as if that happened, yesterday, even though it was hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
So the other thing I just want to pick up on before we talk about China's own record in their own backyard is this Great Wall of Steel they're referring to. Is it made from Australian iron ore?
Well, look, it's a good question, Ricky, and I think it's one of the observations that's been made along the way. I mean, we've had this trade situation with China where they've put sanctions on beef, barley, seafood, and all the rest, and yet our iron ore prices have gone through the roof, and it does make you wonder sometimes what ultimately will be done with that iron ore. It's been suggested along the way that may well one day come back at us in the form of missile technology, but certainly it sounds like it's now being used for the Great Wall of Steel. So look, it is concerning, and these are things that we have to factor into with our relationship with Xi's China. I mean, we be clear about this. We need to be clear about this. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party as opposed to the Chinese people. Chinese people are very good people and people we've always had a good relationship with. But this regime is not our friend, and we need to be careful on every level how we interact. Yeah,
thankfully the Australian economy's cranking along reasonably well, but part of it is because our coal, iron ore and wool are all going pretty heavily into China, even the beef we're reporting on in our agricultural data. But it just goes to show you can be pretty tense with a country and we can be hit with some tariffs, but they can still be a pretty major trading partner.
Yeah, that's right. It's exactly right. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that now, and that's good. We do need to keep trading with China, but I think, as you say, it needs to be with an eye on the future.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to this. I know the former PM John Howard made some comments about our moral obligations with Afghan interpreters. This issue of moral responsibility on the global stage. Can we turn a blind eye to China's human rights record in their own turf?
Well, look, I don't think we can, and I don't think we should, and it is quite an extraordinary track record when you look at it in its whole, particularly over the last 30 years or so. We're talking about a regime that's now got something in the order of 1 million Uyghur people and other minorities under lock and key for no particular reason, being sterilised, being forced re-educated, being removed from their homes, the cultural desecration of their area up in Xinjiang, the destruction of mosques and these sorts of things. And that comes on the heel of the treatment of Tibetans, which of course has had its own history in that period. And of course, not to be forgotten are just the general freedoms which are being lost in places like Hong Kong. I mean, we're now looking at serious incursions into freedom of speech, which are human rights breaches as well, and the overthrow of the long-standing Sino-British agreement there. So this is as long as your arm, and it is something that we need to bear in mind at all times because, these are real people bring real problems in China, and we have to be alive to that.
And so China sometimes in their rhetoric towards Australia have wagged the finger at us about our human rights record, and we've had to front up recently for our regular report card in front of the Human Rights Council. What is this Human Rights Council at the UN? What does it represent?
Well, it's a great question, Ricky. And the UN Human Rights Council is a body of the United Nations, which is really its role is to ensure the protection of or against gross and systematic violations of human rights. And of course, that sounds all well and good on the surface. It sounds very important, but when you have a look at the list of member nations that actually sit on that council, it's actually almost like they've picked the 12 biggest human rights violators in there. You've got countries sitting on that council, including China, Cuba, Pakistan, Russia, Somalia, Sudan, countries like this that really have almost their own litany of human rights abuses themselves. And, you sort of have to wonder, this has been going on for many years, why it is that we continue to sit there and be lectured to by countries, like Russia without free elections and countries like China that are locking up millions of Uyghurs. It's almost like putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank in one sense.
I was starting to think about foxes in charge of henhouse as well. You're on the same wavelength here. But does that body get stacked because of this Chinese debt trap diplomacy? Do they end up sort of working their way into getting who they want on that body so they won't be criticised?
Well, I think that's always been the suggestion. The real story, of course, is anyone's guess. But what is a shame, I think, is that we're now seeing the UN, which is a body that's had a very reasonable long-term plan, a very reasonable long-term reason for being, which was saving succeeding generations from war, which has now branched out into these other little areas, which I think are being exploited by China. And we're talking about bodies like the UN Commission for Women, which, once again, in a similar vein, has Saudi Arabia, a country that won't allow women to drive, or I think it used not to, it does now, but has one of the more misogynistic outlooks of any country in the world that's sitting voting on that body, and even the bodies like UNESCO, which now have almost the same membership, countries like Russia, Zimbabwe, China. So you can only draw a conclusion in there that it's almost better to be the teacher of the class and calling the shots than it is to be one of the students. And I think that's what we're seeing here now. I think there is influence being placed to get these countries, which do have very concerning human rights and other track records, being the ones that are pointing the finger because it's convenient to do so. They don't want to have that finger pointing back at them, and you can only speculate as to why that might be.
Well, I think the picture went around not long ago when the Saudis got on that Women's Rights Council at the UN that their Council for Women at the Saudi level is all men.
That's right. And I think that sums up the folly of it. And, it's a great shame because I think the United Nations started off with very reasonable intentions and now has almost degenerated into, as you say, on many levels, this sort of body that is doing the work of organisations like the Chinese Communist Party, and it is a very, very sad thing.
And I think we we faced the music there with our report card on human rights maybe yesterday in the Geneva time. Haven't been able to catch up with the outcome there, but how is Australia's human rights record compared to some of these countries? Have we got some things we need to be ashamed of?
Look, I think really, when you put it into perspective, our record in that space is exemplary. I think we have to be realistic about this. We're not a country that, we're a country that rates very highly in terms of our democratic index. We're a country that broadly has, I think, equal rights for almost all, including, Indigenous people and the rights of women and the rights of the LGBTI community. We've got to factor this into account. This is stuff which, in many ways, I think every country has things in their past that they're not proud of. But we're looking at being criticised for the now, not the past in these organisations. And for countries like China to be pointing the finger at Australia for human rights violations is utterly laughable. It's almost parody.
Well, just skimming through some of those human rights in the last report card Australia had to submit, religious freedom is one of them, and it was mentioned that there was this draft bill on religious freedom that the government is considering. We chatted about that a little while ago, but is there going to be movement on that front? Do you think there'll be some reform on religious freedom before, say, the end of this year?
Well, look, I certainly hope there will be. I can't give you the timeline, but I'm certainly very hopeful that there will be something back in the mix. As we discussed a couple of weeks ago, I think, on your show, there is this push to have a third incarnation of that religious discrimination bill, which is really very important. It was an election promise. It's something that I'm pushing very hard to see come out the other end of the pipe, because we are living, I think, in a society, at least at state level around the country, where we are, for the first time, I think, seeing the pinch on religious freedoms. I mean, you only have to look at what happened in Victoria with their conversion therapy bill there, which is now really, on many measures, criminalising the truth. And so I think there's an urgent need for this, not the least of which being this was an election promise after the same-sex marriage debate. So look, I'm continuing to work on that, and I'm very hopeful that we will get something as soon as we can.
Well, I think on that religious freedom front, to finish off, the churches will be very happy to literally sing Hallelujah this week, because they couldn't sing or dance or anything in their churches because of COVID restrictions. So they're back to normal business this week.
Absolutely, and it's good to see.
All right, Senator Antic, thanks for joining us again. I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks again, Ricky.